Hello once again. How y'all doing? Welcome to my video series that I call Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you can't help but be drawn to true crime cases, so we're going to talk about one today. If you are also drawn to true crime, and want to feel better about your own makeup skills at the same time, you are absolutely welcome to like, subscribe, and let's hang out together every other Tuesday while I will take a thorough, deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. So yeah, before we get started, you probably saw the slate before the start of the video. Yeah, my grandpa, my papa, passed away this, what was it? God, I think last Wednesday now. And this episode is dedicated to him. I also dedicated my last Crime Dip episode to him. So, yeah, I mean, he was 88 and got to live a long, happy life and got to be surrounded by his loved ones at his home. So that was good. And I got to see him one last time when he was, healthy. So that was really nice. Rip Papa, you'll be missed. We love you. Secondly, I wanted to say, sorry I've been slacking on the comments lately. Jeff usually helps me. He'll usually go and like comments and then tell me which ones to respond to. Usually it's case suggestions. And he got busy with work. I've been busy, so sorry for falling behind. I think I'm caught up now. But yeah. And speaking of case suggestions, today's case is a requested case. Yeah, are y'all ready for the penultimate video? All right, last case, but we still have one more video after this. It is part 1, and this case was suggested by Tyler Manter, and so if you've been with me for a while, you can guess that it's a Delaware case. Today, we're going to be talking about the case of Billy Bailey, who was one of the last men hanged in the United States. Yeah, it's a pretty wild case. It's one of those cases where the actual crime and the trial behind it kind of, we get through or whatever, but that does not mean it's the end of the case. You know what I'm saying? It's one of those. So it's very fascinating, very sad, of course, in a multitude of ways. So thank you, Tyler Manter, for suggesting this case. I see you. Just, it takes me time because I do a lot of research. Unfortunately, there will not be any video clips. I think this case is just kind of too old. I couldn't find any, video clips or anything of them talking about it. But of course, as always, there's lots of news articles. Also be warned, yeah, there's cussing. There is one quote that has a very outdated term for those who are, mentally disabled or whatever. I, of course, am not going to say that, but yeah, just be forewarned. It's going to be showing up in that quote. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into our penultimate video. All right, guys, one more video after this, and I gotta go spit out this baby. So let's go ahead and get into Billy Bailey. And with this case, let's start with Billy and his life. So Billy Bailey was born sometime in December of 1946 or January 1947. Couldn't find an exact birth date, in Smyrna, Delaware. There's some incomplete information or missing information, probably because this story is so old. But one article said that Billy was the 19th of 23 children. Other reports stated that he was the youngest of the 23 children, and yet even more reports said that he was the 9th of 23 children. So don't know what number he fell at, but yeah, he had 23 siblings, or 22 siblings rather. Yeah, can you believe that? Yeah, I'm sorry. It sounds like Billy's dad needs to keep it in his pants, right? His father, Samuel James Bailey, had 4 wives, and Billy's mother, Mazzie Miller Bailey, was his 3rd wife. Now, on top of Billy, Samuel and Mazzie had 4 other children, so it seems that Billy had 4 direct, full siblings, and then the rest were all half-siblings. And this included a daughter named Betty and a son named Samuel Jr. Now, Mazzie, unfortunately, would end up passing away on St. Patrick's Day in 1946, Some articles state that Billy was 4 months old. Others stated that he was 6 months old. But either way, he lost his mother when he was still a baby. And it was said Betty was around 4 years old. Now, after she died, Billy, along with Betty and Sam Jr., and I think the rest of his full siblings, then lived with their father Samuel and his fourth wife. Don't know if he had her in the rafters or what, but yeah, he quickly got a fourth wife. Her name was Murtis Bailey, and it would be Samuel, Murtis, Billy, Betty, Samuel Jr., and 4 other siblings living in a 2-bedroom shack with no indoor plumbing. They were in South Carolina at this point, and again, don't have details of, how long it was between Mazzie dying and Samuel marrying again, or the status of all the children, not sure. I just know that after Mazzie died, or maybe it's Maisie, died, Samuel quickly moved on to Murtis, and they were in South Carolina, and Billy had to share a 2-bedroom shack with no indoor plumbing with 6 other siblings. According to court records, it is said that their living conditions were described as, quote, utter filth and poverty. To make matters worse, Betty said their stepmother was not kind. Yeah, she had to go full trope, full stereotype. And she said, quote, she marched into the house and said, I'm your mama now. From then on, it was beat and bang all your dang life. Yeah, so on top of, losing their mother at a very young age, now they had the wicked stepmother from fairy tales, right? Betty said that their stepmother was also quote-unquote slick with the abuse. Quote, she always beat us so she left marks where Daddy couldn't see. One day, our older half-sister Marie came to visit and looked at our backs, covered with welts. She took Daddy out in the yard and said, have you seen your kids' backs? Daddy pulled our clothes apart and looked at our backs. He told Murtis, don't you ever whip my kids again. I'll do any whipping that has to be done. Yeah, not much better. But, this was back in the days when, physically abusing your kids was seen as perfectly normal. However, even after, Samuel found this out and told Murtis, don't you, do that, I'll take care of that, Betty said the abuse didn't stop. She said by that time, their father was, quote, getting senile by then, and Murtis could twist him all around. When their father would get home after, working the fields all day, Murtis would just straight up lie to him. Betty said, quote, she'd tell him we were bad, and he'd beat us up one side and down the other. Yeah, not a good home life. Not a good start at all. Now, when Samuel was admitted to the hospital for what would be his final illness, just before his death, it is said Murtis offloaded as many of the children as she could. And again, I don't really have any information on if any of these children were her biological children or they were all Samuel's from previous marriages. There just aren't a lot of minute details like that. It just said that Murtis, and Betty said as well, that Murtis just tried to offload as many of the children as she could. Yeah, she's a real peach. Betty's older half-sister, Marie, she was sent to a reform school. Again, I don't know how old Marie was. I thought that Marie wasn't living with them, because remember, Betty said that Marie visited one time and saw the welts and stuff that Murtis had left, so I don't know. All Betty said was that at this point in time, Marie was sent off to a reform school. Betty herself said that she was sent to go live with a cousin in North Carolina. And 10-year-old Bailey and 12-year-old Samuel Jr. were sent up north to Delaware, which we will get more into in a moment. And it is said at this time, at 10 and 12 years old, Samuel Jr. and Billy were already very heavy drinkers. Yeah, isn't that fucking sad? My God. Kind of hard to blame him though, right? Samuel Jr. would actually end up dying in 1956 due to his alcoholism. Now, Betty said the cousin that she stayed with brought her to the hospital to say a final goodbye to her father. And I don't know the minute details. Betty just said that Murtis then left her there at the hospital. So I don't know if the cousin dropped Betty off and thought Murtis was going to take her or what. She just said that Murtis, quote, disappeared from the hospital and left me. I'd never been in that town and I didn't know what to do. Around midnight, I guess a doctor called Marie. So I don't know if she was 18 or not. Again, these are just kind of the little minute details that I wasn't quite sure on. But they called Marie to come pick Betty up, and Betty said, quote, Marie took me home and found me some clothes, and I stayed with her. Now, eventually, though, Murtis did take Betty in. Again, I don't know the details about that. Betty just said, quote, she was going to put me in an orphanage, but I was a good worker. I stayed there until I was 17, and then I ran away. Yeah, Betty got away from Murtis as quickly as she could. She ran away at 17. Betty would actually end up marrying a young rich guy in Florida. However, he would also pass away really young. And she would eventually marry her second husband, Robert Odom. She said of her life, quote, I went from poor to rich and back to poor. I couldn't be bothered with all that nonsense that the rich have to deal with. Now, let's go back to Billy and Sam Jr., right? We talked about how they were kind of offloaded to Delaware. Well, let's pick up where they left off. So yeah, Billy and Sam Jr. were sent to Delaware. They were sent there to live with an older half-brother and his wife and 2 children, and they lived on Wilmington's Madison Street. And according to Billy, he said, their living conditions did not improve that much. He said that he and his brother suffered a lot of physical abuse, and all he remembered was, quote, getting beat a lot, blood running down my back, both me and Sam. Apparently they were beat for, not keeping the house clean, not doing their chores, for misbehaving, and from stealing. For stealing. I guess the boys, it said they were always hungry, so I don't know if their older half-brother wasn't taking care of them, or if, I don't know, growing up in abject poverty, they were just always hungry. I don't know. But they would steal food from local merchants because they were always hungry. Now, after living with their older half-brother and his family for about 2 years, both Billy and Sam were given to the Governor Bacon Health Center, and this was located in Delaware City. A psychiatrist there, who examined Billy, who now was 12 years old, described Billy as, quote, a rather small-looking 12-year-old youngster with a shock of blonde hair and a rather pleasant face, extremely disabled academically, too disturbed a child to consider foster home placement. Yeah, they thought he was too intellectually disabled to place in a foster home. Isn't that that's terrible. But also unsurprising when you consider the time period, right? Billy later talked about his experience at the Bacon Health Center, and he said, quote, when I asked for help with my epileptic seizures, the counselor said they were just temper tantrums. I would have got help if I could. I didn't know how. They'd throw you in a cell and leave you there, even at Bacon. They'd feed you some yellow gunky-looking stuff, some medicine, and then forget about you. Now, it is said at best, right? At best, Billy had a 6th or 7th grade education, although other sources said that he really only had up to a 4th grade education. So either way, right? Billy was not, educated all that much or all that well. He was in and out of Delaware State Hospital. And then eventually, he and Sam Jr. ended up in the Ferris School for Delinquent Boys. And this was located near Price's Corner. Now, while at Ferris, Billy actually did have a little bit of luck, right? His luck turned around just a little bit. And that was because he ended up meeting a fellow student/inmate, Lauren Sonny Seaman. And he was the son of Lawrence and Corinne Seaman. And they lived in Cheswold, Delaware. All right. So he meets this fellow youngster while at that school. And after being discharged from Ferris at 14 years old, other sources said that Billy was 16. Billy and Sonny actually went to go live with Sonny's family. So yeah, that was good. The Seamans decided to take Billy in. And when he went to go live with the Seamans, he actually ended up gaining a foster sister. Her name was Sue Ann, and she was about 11 or 12 when Billy came to stay with them. I don't know what happened to Sam Jr. I tried finding out, but all I could find was when he died in 1956. Now, Sue Ann said that, yeah, Billy and Sonny were discharged at the same time, and Billy had nowhere else to go, so her parents took him in. She went on to say, quote, Billy and I were very close and did a lot of things together. And she said at first when, Billy came to stay with them that he was very, very shy at first, but he eventually opened up, and he actually became kind of like an older brother to her. And she said he actually became kind of like an older brother to other teenage boys in the neighborhood. Sue Ann said as a teenager, quote, he didn't drink any more than the rest of the boys on Friday or Saturday night if they could get someone to buy some beer for them. Billy apparently worked in plumbing with Sue Ann's uncle, so he gained some experience in that. And then he also worked in the mortuary at the Dover Air Force Base. Additionally, he did other handiwork such as plumbing, electrical work, and painting in order to support himself. So he had a lot of experience with his hands and kind of like manual work. Now, after Lawrence, his foster father, died, Sue Ann said, quote, Billy went into a turmoil when Dad died, thinking he would be sent away again, but Mom kept him along with the four of us. Sue Ann recalled hanging out with Billy, who was 16 at this time. And even at this time, even after spending some time with the Seamans a little bit and opening up, he was still a bit shy. But she remembers, hanging out at the local teenager spots, which was sort of like the pool hall and the candy store in like 1959, 1960. That's where all the teens hung out at the time in that town. And Sue Ann said, again, right, like Billy didn't open up too much, but, like, he would open up a little bit to her. And she said, quote, he never said much about his childhood, except for the beatings, but my parents never raised a hand to Billy. So, right, at least he got to experience a little bit of a stable household. However, I think the damage had been done by that point because Billy, unfortunately, would end up having a very, very long criminal career, and it would start at the young age of 17. Now, most of his crimes would center around robbery and forgery, and his first felony occurred at 17 years old. Yeah, his criminal career started at 17, and it started with a felony. In 1967, when he was 20 years old, he was charged with disorderly conduct, and this was after he had run down Lockerman Street in Dover with a rifle. Apparently, he also had an assault charge tacked to this, but it must have been a misdemeanor because he got off of that with a $10 fine. Later in that same year, all right, so 1967, he was arrested again, this time for a charge of grand larceny after stealing from a Dover restaurant. The next year, 1968, he was arrested for burglarizing a home, again in the city of Dover. And in 1969, he was twice charged and convicted on forgery charges. So yeah, he had built up quite a rap sheet in a short amount of time, too, I mean, I'm gonna assume that, the damage was just done from his childhood. Plus, like, when you get into the fact that he was, a little, maybe intellectually disabled or slow, however you want to describe it, probably didn't help either, right? Guessing he probably fell in with kind of a rough crowd, And then on December 20th, 1970, when he was 24 years old, Billy married his wife, 19-year-old Susan Hughes. Billy would later say that it was one of the only happy moments in his life. And approximately a year later, they had a daughter whom they named Christine. Apparently, according to some sources, Billy apparently fathered another child about 5 to 6 years prior named Danny, but that's all we know about that. But just because he was married and had a child didn't stop his habits. In 1971, Billy was charged and convicted of theft. In 1974, he was arrested and charged for stealing about $1,500 worth of equipment from a Dover industrial plant. And on February 14th, 1975, Valentine's Day, Billy was sentenced to 5 years in the Delaware Correctional Center, but after serving just a little over 2 years of his sentence, he was granted parole on Tuesday, April 5th, 1977. However, the same year he was put out on parole, 1977, he was pulled over for drunk driving. And of course, right, because he was out on parole, he had to appear before the parole board. But they allowed him to continue his parole despite this. However, only a year later, on August 1st, 1978, he committed another parole violation. And this is when he and a co-defendant had stolen a check from a mailbox and had unsuccessfully tried to cash it at a liquor store. And I think he was still out on parole. I don't think he was behind bars after, being charged with this. He was still awaiting, I think, sentencing or his trial or something. But while he was waiting, for his sentence or punishment, this is when Susan left him. She took their daughter Christine and went to stay with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Hughes. Billy said his in-laws, quote, put the bad mouth on me, took away my wife and daughter. No, dude, you took away your own wife and daughter. Like, come on, dude, you got a kid now, and he just keeps committing crimes, especially when he has skills, right? We talked about all the experience he got while he was at the Seamans, and he decided to just keep committing crimes. After she left, Susan also did not let Billy see their daughter And apparently, oh God, this was awful to read about. So apparently when Christine was like 3 months old, a fire had started in Billy and Susan's mobile home. They were asleep. It was the middle of the night. A vaporizer, I guess, had dried out, and it was near Christine's crib, and it started a fire. Now, Billy was successful in rescuing his daughter from the fire. However, he and Christine did still suffer damage from it. Sue Ann said Christine was, everything to Billy. Quote, "It tore his world apart. Christine was his world. Billy burnt his own hands trying to save her." And yeah, so Billy, suffered, I think, badly burned hands, and poor little Christine, her little left hand had to be amputated in the end. Isn't that awful? And according to Sue Ann, it was after this incident that Billy began drinking really heavily. As we'll get into, I don't know how much I trust Sue Ann's recollection of things. I think Billy had already been drinking a while. Remember, we said starting at 10 years old, he had a really bad drinking problem, but I'm going to guess that it definitely escalated after this accident. Sue Ann also claimed that some neighbors and locals actually blamed Billy for the fire. And she said, quote, "And that hurt him a lot. He cried over that. But, right, with his increased drinking came the abuse. And Susan had had enough after a few years, in and out of jail. And he, abused her, I guess. I don't know if it was physically, emotionally, mentally, probably all. But yeah, Susan had enough and decided to go live with her parents. On August 12th of that year, Billy showed up to Susan's workplace. It was the Delaware Home and Hospital for the Chronically Ill, and he showed 2 shotgun shells to a nurse on duty there and said one was for Susan and the other was for himself. And later that same day, Billy's father-in-law, Susan's father's car was riddled with buckshots. And I think it was after this, right, because it wasn't too hard to surmise that it was probably Billy who had done that. Billy was once again taken to the Delaware State Hospital for a 72-hour examination. When he was discharged from there, he was then sent to the prison in Smyrna, and a note was placed in his file. And this note read, quote, "Do not release. Hold for Delaware Parole Board." Because of course, right, all this going on, Billy was still on parole. I don't know how long he was supposed to be on parole for, but I'm sure it was probably, for some time. Another note in Billy's file stated that he was still to be tried in Kent County for a forgery charge. And on December 12th, 1978, he was found guilty on that forgery charge in Kent County. A pre-sentence investigation was then ordered for this charge, so he was not yet sentenced. He was convicted of this forgery charge, but had not yet been sentenced. So they had a pre-sentencing investigation. Billy was then sent back to the Smyrna prison, and then he was sent to the prison in Sussex. Now, Billy would eventually be sentenced to 18 months. I don't know if that was on the Kent County charge or what he had been thrown into the correction center for. As we'll see, there will be a lot of clerical screw-ups that occurred, and that's the reason why the events of today's case happened. On January 10th, 1979, the Attorney General's office filed a motion in Kent County Superior Court asking them to sentence Billy as a habitual offender, and they wanted to sentence him to life without the possibility of parole as a habitual offender. So I don't think that 18 months he was sentenced to was for the Kent County charge, or if it was, the Attorney General's office wanted more. They wanted him to be sentenced to prison for life because of just his record. Donald Davis, who was the assistant warden of the Smyrna prison, who was in charge of treatment, wrote in Billy's file that Billy was, quote, "a genuine old-fashioned drunk, mentally limited, and when drunk, open to any suggestion or thought, no matter how violent or reckless." Billy's prison file also showed that he had attempted suicide several times behind bars. He had fought with other prisoners. He had attacked guards. And he had been in and out of several AA programs throughout his criminal career in an attempt to control his drinking. Now, when he was sober, all the counselors agreed that Billy was a very industrious, hard worker, and was even pleasant to be around. He was very mild-mannered. But when he was drunk, he became very belligerent and, quote, fairly impossible to control. However, get this, all right? So we talked about a lot of clerical error that occurs that led to the events of today's case. Well, this is the start of it. So in this year of 1979, on April 26th, after only serving 4 months of his 18-month sentence, Billy was approved for work release. Yeah, a work release program. And on May 4th, he was assigned to the Plummer Work Release Center. And this was a work release facility located in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, with the work release program, right, prisoners can be put, or are eligible, I should say, for work release if they have less than a year left to serve on their sentence. And they're officially approved for work release after getting approval from 2 committees. And then the committee's approvals then have to be approved by the State Prison Commissioner, James T. Vaughn, and the Chief of Adult Prisons, John J. Molvina III. So yeah, right, like, that's a lot of approval to get through, right? First you have to be eligible, and then you have to be approved by these 2 committees, and then even after those committees, like, kind of submit their recommendations, then had to be approved by 2 heads. And Billy got through. Now, at the Plummer Work Release Center, prisoners live there, and they live there under very minimal supervision. They go out on jobs in the community, earn regular wages like anyone else, and they pay the center $26 a week for room and board. Billy was employed by his brother-in-law, Charles Coker, and he was a livestock trader, and he employed Billy as a laborer. And Charlie was actually married to Billy's foster sister, Sue Ann, who was now Sue Ann Coker. Now, the Cokers lived in Cheswold in a trailer court, and apparently Billy lived with them. He was on like a 72-hour work furlough from the Plummer house, which basically meant that Billy primarily lived with his foster sister and her husband, and then he had to check in with the Plummer house every 72 hours. Yeah, can you believe this? And I'm not sure what checking in with Plummer house entailed. It just said after, a brief stay at Plummer house, he was then, free to go back to living with his foster sister and her husband. On Thursday, May 18th, Billy actually helped a Delaware corrections officer move from one apartment to another. The guard's name was Mark Thomas, and it wasn't until after Thomas was unpacking all of his stuff that he realized his .22 caliber pistol, 6 shotguns, and his .30-30 rifle were all missing. Wonder who could have taken them. Meanwhile, right, Billy went on with his day, and apparently Billy only had 3 months left to work on the work release program before he'd be free entirely. Yeah. However, on the next day, right, Friday, May 19th, Billy had his work release revoked. And this was because prison officials had finally found out that Billy was still, like, in hot water with the Kent County Superior Court. Again, I don't know if that 18-month sentence was for something else, but I don't think it was for the Kent County, forgery charge? It was forgery or theft. I can't remember what I said, because he has so many charges. But prison officials, yeah, they discovered this oversight. They had not known that Billy still had, charges in Kent County to pay for, right? And so, on that Friday, they told Billy that he had to come back to the Plummer house, and that his work release was going to be revoked because of this, right? So before being informed, right, that he was going to go back to Plummer house earlier that day, Billy had purchased 6 boxes of .22 caliber cartridges and 2 boxes of .30-30s. And he bought these from Ernest Faulkner, who ran a gun shop at Pearson's Corner. Apparently, Billy had come into a shop looking for .22 shells, and he wanted to bring his pistol in to see if that they would fit, but Ernest was like, no, I don't really want, loaded firearms in my store, so he went out front to check for Billy. So yeah, after that, Billy was informed that, hey man, you gotta come back to Plummer house, like, your work release is being revoked. And so he stayed at Plummer house over the weekend. And on Monday, May 22nd, 1979, prison officials were dispatched to then bring Billy back to the prison. He was going to be brought back to the prison in Smyrna. However, right, Billy's at Plummer house, right, and he sees the prison officials coming, and he decides to bolt. Just as they entered through the front door, Billy escaped out the back. Quote, he saw them and bolted. They got as close as the officers going in the front door and him running out the back. Billy, who was 33 years old, was now on the run. His disappearance was then discovered at 1 p.m. Ooh, sorry guys, I am dying. I'm sweating so much it's getting hard to put on my makeup. So sorry if you hear some ambient background noise. I just turned on my fan on super low. I need some sort of air flow in here because I am dying. Anyway, so Billy's on the run from Plummer House. And he ended up running to the Cokers, and he arrived there around 3:30 p.m., quote, crying. He told his sister that he was upset and he was not going to go back to Plummer House. Quote, he said there was no need for me to beg him to go back to Plummer House because he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life in jail for something he didn't think he had done. Okay, yeah, but you have done all these things, Billy. You have. Sue Ann said her brother was, quote, pale and upset and got to crying and said he had lost everything he had and lost everyone he had ever loved. Billy then went into their kitchen and with a steak knife tried to, cut himself, I guess, to, commit suicide or something. But Sue Ann managed to wrestle the knife away from him, but she cut her hand in the process. Billy then asked Charles, his brother-in-law, if he would drive him to Dover. Charles agreed, so Billy then kissed his sister Sue Ann goodbye and just told her, quote, whatever happens to me, you will know about it. And then Billy and Charles then left the home in Charles's truck. All right. Now, as they were driving, Billy asked Charles to stop by a liquor store. It was the Cheswold Beverage Mart, and it was about a mile away from the Coker's place where they lived. It was a cinder block package store, and Charles agreed. So he pulled into the parking lot, and he stayed in the truck as Billy went inside. He entered the store at approximately 3:40 p.m., and once he entered the store, the store's clerk, Reba Lovegrove, said that Billy was wiping tears from his face as he entered, and as he was wiping his face, he approached the counter and asked her for a pint of Smirnoff vodka. He put down a $5 bill and asked for a $3.35 bottle of the vodka. Now, as Reba was making change for Billy, that's when he withdrew his .22 caliber pistol and demanded that Reba hand over all the money in the cash register. And I think probably just kind of going on instinct, right, and shock, Reba just automatically shoved the register closed, slamming it shut, and she said, quote, evidently the man's sick. He's gotta be. He was crying when he walked in. Tears were running down his cheeks. So yeah, she was just what's going on? No, and just I think probably out of instinct, just slammed the register shut. That is when Billy pulled the trigger on the pistol 3 times. Yeah, talk about a frightening experience. However, the gun wasn't loaded, and so all it did was click 3 times. Can you imagine the panic and fear that Reba probably experienced there? My God. After, the gun didn't go off, Billy just kind of shoved Reba to the ground and tried to open the register, but he ended up just jamming it. So he grabbed the $5 from Reba, I'm guessing probably the $5 that he gave her, along with a handful of extra bills that I guess he found under the counter. And he ran from the store, but not before he grabbed his vodka. Meanwhile, right, Charles is in his truck waiting for Billy, and it wasn't until he saw Billy running out with the pint of vodka and he heard Reba scream that he realized, oh shit, Billy must have done something. Billy then pointed the gun at his brother-in-law and said, quote, we gotta go because the police will be after us. Charles, right, under threat of the gun, then continued the drive to Dover. However, only about a mile and a half down the road, at Lambertson's Corner, which was this wooded area, Billy got out of Charles's truck. He told Charles to go to his father's house that was nearby, and he decided to flee on foot, telling Charles that he would go up the branch to evade the police. Charles would later say that Billy took off with 2 pints of vodka, a bottle of Pepsi, a carton of cigarettes, and, of course, the pistol that he had. After Billy left on foot, Charles went back to the liquor store, quote, to see if the lady was okay. Reba and Charles both then notified police, Charles giving the police a complete description of his brother-in-law. And a helicopter and cars were immediately dispatched to the area to look for Billy. So while all that went down, let's go back to Billy, right? Fleeing on foot, he was at Lambertson's Corner. So at Lambertson's Corner, at 4:25 p.m., Billy entered the farmhouse of Gilbert S. Lambertson, who was 80 years old, and his wife, Clara Lambertson, who was 73. Now, let's get a little bit into the Lambertsons, all right? They had 4 grown children at this point, 2 sons named Saxton and Dilbert, and they had 2 daughters named Mary and Betty. And again, they were all grown. They also had a foster son named Andy Foltz, who would actually grow up to become a Delaware state senator. By this point in time, right, when Billy enters the home, they had 14 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren. Now, the Lambertsons, they tended to their 50-acre farm, and they mostly grew soybeans at this point. Gilbert, get this, Gilbert was actually born and raised in the farmhouse that he lived with his wife and raised his own children in. Isn't that wild? Now, the Lambertson children said that Gilbert would discipline them just with a look. Didn't raise a hand to him. Or, when his 2 sons would fight, he would just force them to stare at each other until they apologized to each other. It was said Clara was discreetly religious, and she carried a Bible with her everywhere she went, and she would actually have, certain passages underlined or highlighted. Additionally, she also loved making jams and jellies and handing them out as gifts. A family member said, quote, "They were the kind of people who never asked anyone for anything. They were quiet, retiring, and very self-sufficient." And this was according to Kathleen Kokomo, who was actually related to Lambertsons by marriage. Betty also spoke about her parents and said that they were, quote, "elderly but so young at heart and pretty much retired." Albert Cusack was the Lambertsons' nearest neighbor, and he said Gilbert was, quote, "always out in the garden. He's been farming all his life, and his dad before him." Now, I guess back in the day, back in their prime, the Lambertsons had a 67-acre farm, but by this point in time, it had been leased out, so they no longer had cows, chickens, pigs, and that kind of stuff. However, when the Lambertson children were growing up, they were expected to help tend the farm. Quote, "Daddy didn't need hired hands. He had us. I can still see him leaning on a shovel after digging a long row of little holes for the tomato plants. And I'd be looking up at him from my hands and knees, putting a tomato plant in each hole." And this was according to Betty. Dilbert described his parents as, quote, "2 very quiet, content people that never bothered a soul. The only place they ever went was down to the Acme in Dover to get groceries. They usually stayed on the farm." Echoing this same sentiment, Betty added, quote, "They were homebodies, hated to leave their house. They never traveled. They didn't even leave Delaware very often." Mary, their other daughter, said that their mother, Clara, quote, "liked being outside. I can remember her working all day outside and then going into the kitchen and cooking a big meal for all of us." And Betty recalled how much her father loved listening to the Phillies game. That was his favorite team, and he loved turning on the radio and just listening to the baseball game. Quote, "Many's the time he'd let the cows wait to be milked while he listened to the game." So those were the Lambertsons, all right? So Gilbert and Clara, older and retired, right? 4 grown children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And on this day, Billy entered their farmhouse. And no one knows how Billy got into the farmhouse. Some wondered if maybe he saw Gilbert working in the field and demanded his car keys. And Albert, remember, the Lambertsons' nearest neighbor, he was working on his tractor at this time. And he said if Billy had done that, quote, "I'll tell you this, if that guy asked for Gilbert's car keys, more than likely he wouldn't give them up." And it's also possible that Billy just waltz into the farmhouse. Clara was inside and Gilbert was tending to his garden. And, these were back in the days that people didn't really lock their doors, and the Lambertsons had lived there, right? For a super long time, I doubt they locked their doors. So it's also possible that Billy just waltzed right in. What we do know is that Billy entered the farmhouse, and as Clara sat in her rocking chair, Billy shot her once in the shoulder with his pistol from behind. And as Gilbert came in from the outside, I'm wondering if maybe he heard the gunshot go off. But as he came in from outside, Billy shot him in the hand twice, another time in the chest, and another time in the face. It's not exactly clear how, but Billy did manage to get the Lambert's 12-gauge single-barreled shotgun. They kept it, I think, in a corner towards the entrance of the house. It's theorized that maybe after, Gilbert was shot in the hand or something, maybe he went to get the gun, but Billy got it from him. But either way, yeah, Billy had shot Gilbert in the face with his own shotgun. And then he turned around and shot Clara again, this time in the stomach, / abdomen area. And he shot her again in the neck. And both Lambertsons, of course, unfortunately, died. Billy then arranged their bodies in chairs in the living room and then fled. Now, the Lambertsons' daughter-in-law, Marion Lambertson, who was married to their son Saxton, would end up discovering her in-laws' bodies like mere minutes after Billy killed them. However, that's what initial reports said, that she stumbled upon their bodies, but later reports stated that all she did was like kind of step into the home and call for them, but they didn't answer. And she didn't go further into the home. But she did see Billy running from the house shortly before she entered it. She had been picking strawberries from a field across the way. And as she was picking strawberries, she had seen like the police helicopter converging, probably flying down low. And that's probably what caused her to go to her in-laws' house to be like, dude, like what's going on, you know? And yeah, she saw Billy running from the house. Oh, and she also saw police cars, I think, coming down the road towards the house. So that was probably another reason why she decided to go to the home and be like, dudes, what is going on? Now, shortly after she had arrived at the farmhouse, I'm guessing just peeking in and calling out her in-laws' names, she heard a single shot, followed mere minutes later by 2 more shots. And these 2 shots were like in very close succession to each other. And what she had heard was Billy firing at the police helicopter that had converged on him. So after she heard these shots, she then saw Billy running with the shotgun in his right hand. And he was running from in between 2 chicken houses on the property. And he was headed towards the woods that were in the backyard of the Lambertsons' property. And this is when some reports state that she went in the house and discovered her in-laws' bodies. So yeah, I don't know if she just stepped in and called for their names and didn't get an answer, or if she actually did. Reports varied on that. But it is said that there was so much blood at the crime scene, like the police couldn't even really determine if there had been like a struggle or not. There was like blood everywhere. And it is also said that the Lambertsons were shot at such a close range that the plastic powder pistons containing the shotgun pellets were found inside their bodies. Yeah, just brutal, man. Meanwhile, right, let's get to Billy, right? So he's running across the backyard of the Lambertsons' property, headed towards the woods, and the police helicopter, right, was right there converging on him. So he had been spotted by the Delaware State Police helicopter as he had been running across the back of their field. And the pilot, Lieutenant James Wolfe, actually landed the chopper. And the co-pilot, Delaware Trooper Corporal Thomas W. Robbins, leapt out immediately as soon as like the helicopter landed with his revolver drawn. Robbins chased Billy, who, remember, was still wielding the shotgun. However, as Billy was running, he tripped and fell. And Robbins was able to converge on him and step on the shotgun to prevent Billy from picking it up. And he demanded, right, like, you know, get up, you know, put your hands up and, you know, all that. But as Billy did that, he withdrew the .22 pistol. And as he, you know, did that and turned around, he shot at Robbins point blank, but he missed. Robbins then jumped on Billy, cutting his own hand in the process, but he managed to get the gun away from Billy. Managed to disarm him, and then he handcuffed him. He was arrested. He was arrested right in the farm field with the shotgun and the pistol, and he was charged with armed robbery along with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And when Marianne saw the police dragging Billy out, right, handcuffed, right, from behind her in-laws' farmhouse, she would later say, quote, "I asked him why he killed those 2 innocent people, and he said he didn't." And, of course, she then had to call her husband, Saxton, and explain what had happened to his parents. Quote, "He asked me if they were dead, and I said no, but I knew they were dead because when I went in and called them, they didn't answer me. They were gone." Mary, the Lambertsons' daughter, remember, apparently she was the only one of the Lambertsons' children who would actually view her parents' bodies, I think, in the house. She said, quote, "I had to see them one more time, and I'm the scary one." She saw Clara in her rocking chair, you know, shot in the neck, so I'm sure that looked pretty brutal. And then she saw her father. He was in the other chair, and half of his face was gone. Oh, God, I don't think I could do that. State police officers Merrill Shaner and Harry O'Neill then put a, quote, "very wild Billy" in the back of their police car. And as they were doing this, Billy was very, very erratic, and he shouted, quote, "You boys got me for the store, but nothing else." That same night, Billy was led into the Magistrate Court 7 in Dover, and he was led here for his arraignment. And he was still pretty wild when he was led into court. He was thrashing around, was being, like, not cooperative at all, and he even ended up scratching a guard with his handcuffs. He was described as, quote, "sloppy and unruly." He was yelling obscenities and profanities. as Magistrate Charles M. Stump started reading, right, the charges that Billy was being charged with, along, of course, right, with describing, like, the potential penalties, I guess Billy just, like, started shouting at Stump, quote, "I want to be shot and hung now. You're gonna put me in jail anyway. There's no bail for this. Why don't you go ahead and kill me, or go ahead and hang me? You know I did it. You know I killed them. Go ahead and hang me. I killed them, so go ahead and kill me. I'm gonna make them kill me tonight." And after his arraignment, Billy was sent to the prison in Smyrna. Now, the next day, Tuesday, May 22nd, because the story, right, broke, this is when prison officials from all the way from the top to the bottom were blamed as details started spreading about Billy, his past, and how the hell he even got approved for work release. There were many complaints that there were other prisoners like Billy out on work release, and that they had no business being so unsupervised when they were clearly a danger to themselves and others. An anonymous source told the local paper, the News Journal, quote, "He was known to have had drinking and emotional problems, but there he was, out on work release, living with his brother-in-law down near Cheswold on a revolving 72-hour work furlough basis." A corrections officer who had actually, like, guarded Billy, right, so was aware of his behavior. I think he stayed anonymous, but he also told the paper, quote, "In the prison, he's a model prisoner, a superb prisoner, but he just cannot handle the street." This officer also, right, informed the paper how Billy's wife had left him in August of 78, and Billy threatened to kill her in-laws, his daughter, and then himself. He also said that, right, Billy had a drinking problem and had been an alcoholic for, quote, "a very, very, very long time," saying that he was a man with a, quote, "very, very violent, quick temper. If he wanted something, and if he wasn't going to get it right away, he'd explode. When he gets drunk, he starts crying. On several occasions at Delaware State Hospital, he was just blubbering." He said he personally knew of at least one occasion where Billy had tried to commit suicide behind bars by slashing his wrists, and I was a little confused about this, but this corrections officer said that Billy, I don't know if he had been on work release before. I'm not even sure when this incident was supposed to have happened, but Billy had come back from work release drunk. So he was being removed from the work release program, and that, like, upset him. So I was a little confused about that. I've said it before, and I'll keep saying it. There's, like, little minutia details that were just kind of hard to come by, probably because the story is just, like, older. Another anonymous corrections officer commented to the paper, quote, "Of course, according to hindsight, he should have been sent immediately to the Delaware Correctional Center instead of being placed in the more or less open setting of the Plummer Center." Francis J. Herron, who was the director of the work release program, said that the reason Billy had been, eligible for a work release program is because even though he had a long criminal history, none of the crimes were violent. They were all non-violent. And he told the paper, quote, "We have only one psychologist at the Smyrna prison, and we are loaded with mental cases that really should be handled by the Delaware State Hospital for the mentally ill. Ordinarily, over the years, the work release system has been a good thing, but then we get a case like this, and doubts about the system are created in the minds of the public." Which, I kind of agree. Like, this whole work release program does seem like a good idea. Like, hey, let's actually rehabilitate these criminals and kind of, like, transition them back into society. What a wild thought, right? And obviously they didn't, do that for violent offenders. But yeah, then you have this one incident like Billy, and now everyone just wants to shut the whole thing down. Now, the Plummer House officials, they were kind of in the dark. They said they didn't know how or why the recent forgery charges from Kent County had come up. They just knew that they had come up. Quote, "We guess it must have popped up in the computer somehow, so we yanked him back to the Plummer Center on Friday for the weekend." And by Wednesday, prison officials came out and admitted to the public that they did not know that when Billy had been approved for work release on May 4th at the Plummer House, that he was still awaiting, his sentencing at in Kent County for that, forgery charge. Prison officials said that they had discovered it that past Friday, which is when, Billy's work release was revoked, and they were going to keep him at the Plummer House over the weekend until prison officials had come that Monday to pick him up. Francis himself had actually brought Billy to the Plummer House on Friday and explained that, they were planning on transporting him to the prison the following Monday. They also stated they were unaware that Billy was being considered as a habitual offender and therefore was being considered a life without parole sentence. They had no idea. And they actually didn't discover this until the day of the murders, until that Monday after Billy had escaped. quote, "Had we known either one of these items in advance, Bailey, who was already serving a 5-year sentence for theft, would certainly not have been out on work release." And this was according to Mulvina III, who, if you will remember, was the chief of adult prisons. He also said it was a clerical error at the Delaware Correctional Center that prevented prison officials from knowing about the other Delaware conviction for forgery, and that this clerical error also caused them to not know that he was still awaiting sentencing on that. Mulvina noted that Billy's prison file was 3 inches thick, weighed 6 pounds, and that his file did take note of the conviction of the forgery charge, but recent reports and updates to that file did not specify that he was still awaiting sentencing on that charge. Mulvina said, quote, "This file is the Bible we use in determining all the facts about a prisoner, and when Bailey's case came up before the 2 release boards, the latest additions to his file did not tell us he was awaiting a sentence." Mulvina said what was confusing to him was why prison officials did not get a copy of the Attorney General's recommendation that Billy be convicted as a habitual offender. And remember, this recommendation had been on January 10th. And Mulvina was like, I don't know why we weren't informed of this until the day of the murders, until that Monday. He said, quote, "The motion was filed by Deputy Attorney General Dana C. Reed in Kent County Superior Court January 10th, and we didn't get a copy of that motion by mail until Monday. It was a clerical or typographical problem. He never should have been in the work release program." Apparently, in Billy's file, his very thick file, there was one entry in there from mid-December, and it did show that Billy had been convicted of theft, and that particular page that had that theft conviction did warn whoever looked at it not to release Billy under any circumstances. However, the subsequent pages in the file did not contain this warning, and in preparing him to go before these committees for work release, prison officials did not go through the entire file. I think they probably only went through the first couple pages, and they did not get to that mid-December entry that stated, "Do not release this prisoner." Mulvina also said that Billy was not immediately sent back to the Smyrna prison because, quote, "There wasn't a sense of emergency in this case. It was forgery rather than a sexual assault or robbery. He has a chronic pattern of offenses, but they've been against property and of a non-violent type." On Thursday, May 24th, the Lambertsons were laid to rest, and that same day, a bill in the Delaware State House of Representatives failed to abolish the work release program altogether. The representative who pushed for this, Charles P. West of course, Delaware, was trying to use Billy's case as a way to just cancel the program altogether, but it failed in a 24-10 vote. This same day, however, Vaughn, remember the state police commissioner, ordered that all work release furloughs, so everyone who was actively out on work release and everyone who was currently trying to go through the process, all that be suspended. This was about 120 inmates who were actively trying to get into work release, and 80 inmates who were actively out on furlough in the work release. He demanded everything be suspended and every single one of those inmates' records be looked over with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that they actually were eligible to be on work release. And from my understanding, he didn't put the 80 inmates who were actively out on furlough, on the work release programs. He didn't put them back behind bars, saying that it was just kind of impractical to do that. But I think he had all their work suspended, so they were probably placed in their release centers and weren't allowed to leave until their cases were reviewed and approved. The governor of Delaware at the time, Pierre S. DuPont IV, also asked for a very detailed report on Billy's criminal history and wanted details of how this had happened, how he had come to be released on work release. Yeah, a lot of officials were getting into hot water with this because people, understandably, right, were very angry, especially the Lambertsons. They were like, what the fuck, And it's kind of hard not to blame them, right? Their parents were elderly, just doing their thing, minding their business, and then they were butchered in their own fucking home. And all due to incompetent morons. On Thursday, May 31st, Billy had his preliminary hearing. It was in the Court of Common Pleas, and it was on the 2 first-degree murder charges, the charge of first-degree robbery, and the charge of possession of a deadly weapon by a convicted felon. He was then bound over to Superior Court for trial. On Friday, June 1st, legal counsel for the governor of Delaware, David S. Swayze, announced that from then on there, right, all prison officials would be given all of the prisoners' records, like all updates, all recent, filings, all that. And in a report that was publicly released on June 7th, and it was a report by Governor DuPont and Vaughn, it was revealed that it wasn't really necessarily a clerical error, like a single clerical error that led to Billy being on work release, but there was a variety of errors. One reason was the adult prison bureau chiefs in the Department of Corrections argued amongst themselves about whether to use probation and parole records, specifically in the case of Billy, whether to use his parole and probation records when it came to his case. Apparently there were some arguments about that. Another error that we already spoke about was that Billy's very thick prison file wasn't really reviewed beyond the first 2 or 3 pages in the file. So the persistent warnings given by different prison officials against his release and his behavior were not reviewed. They also stated the other things that we had, gone over, like how Billy was pretty violent and unruly when he was drunk, but when he wasn't, he was, like a hard, industrious worker. The assistant bureau chief in charge of the work release and furlough committee, Frank A. Loftus, had also ordered that the probation and parole records not be sent to prison officials. Vaughn said that a department official and a secretary, they were sorting probation and parole records in September of 1978. This was during an inventory of the records. And they stated that Loftus denied knowing that the parole and probation records had been sent to the corrections department. At least 2 assistant adult prison bureau chiefs, Francis and Patrick Murphy, they were not fans of Loftus at all. I don't think they agreed with him not sending the probation and parole records. And they were against him, and they stated that they were not going to serve on the institutional classification committee if Loftus was going to stay on as chairman. They did not like the way he was running things. They didn't like that he, didn't want to use probation and parole records. And it seems like Loftus was definitely getting hit hard. Now, in response to this damning report, because everything I just stated was in this report that, remember, was released publicly, Loftus denied everything in the report, and he claimed that he was just being used as a scapegoat, and that, none of it was true or anything like that. So, I don't know. You know how shit, gets political, especially when shit hits the fan, right? And in the end, Governor DuPont ordered a very, very thorough investigation into how Billy and apparently 3 other inmates had escaped or fallen through the cracks of the system. And after this, damning report, understandably, there were public calls for Loftus's termination. Finally, on Friday, June 22nd, 1979, as investigators were underway doing that thorough investigation that Governor DuPont had ordered, Judge George R. Wright then decided to sentence Billy to that life sentence. Remember the habitual offender suggestion? He decided to go ahead and do that. Judge Wright had actually faced Billy numerous times in court, and he said that Billy was a, quote, pathetic person with no hope of changing his ways. At this hearing in court, they also laid out all of Billy's criminal history, 26 convictions, including 6 felonies, in the course of 18 years. And Judge Wright said that he had long decided to sentence Billy as a habitual offender before the murders. And Judge Wright said that the reason that was delayed, sentencing Billy as a habitual offender, is because at that time there was some sort of case that was before the Supreme Court, and it may have had an impact on Billy's case, but in the end it didn't. However, this habitual offender sentence that was supposedly a life sentence, I guess it wasn't really a life sentence. It was a 45-year sentence, and Billy would again be eligible for parole after 15 years. Wright said that the theft, forgery, and robbery charges were not serious enough to warrant life without parole. Billy's public defender in this was Dennis Reardon, and he had pleaded with the judge not to give Billy the life sentence, not to sentence him as a habitual offender, because, quote, God knows what's down the road for Bailey, describing his client as, quote, extremely depressed and has difficult grasping what is going on right now. At this point in time, Billy was being held in the hospital section of the Smyrna Correctional Center, and as you can probably guess, this was after he had attempted suicide. So he was currently being held in the hospital section of the prison. On Friday, July 6th, Billy entered not guilty pleas on the murder charges, the robbery, or the weapons charge. On Wednesday, July 18th, Billy's public defender, Charles K. Muse, maybe he was like Billy's public defender for these specific charges, requested a change of venue for Billy's upcoming trial, citing the publicity, right? Because this was a pretty major story, especially with the whole, like, Billy falling through the cracks and stuff, because this was definitely a preventable murder and crime that he had done. Because let's remember, Reba was also traumatized. However, Judge Wright denied the request, quote, for the time being, citing that the coverage on Billy's case was no more than any other, murder case that had happened in the county. Billy's trial date was then set for February 11th, 1980, and jury selection was to begin on February 5th. However, Billy sent word to the court on February 7th that he intended to represent himself. He intended to show up to court, sans attorney, and defend himself. I guess he told his sister, Sue Ann, on the 10th that he, quote, was going to fire his lawyers because he felt he could defend himself better than his lawyers were doing. Judge Wright ordered Billy's public defenders, there were two of them now, Nancy Jane Mullen and Howard Hillis, to still accompany their client on the trial date. And on that date, right, they met in Judge Wright's chambers. And both Mullen and Hillis, expressed to Judge Wright that they were very concerned about their client's attitude, and they were also worried about Billy's competency in order to defend himself. They didn't think he was quite, capable of defending himself. Sources close to the case anonymously commented to the papers that many believed Billy's attitude kind of suggested that he had a death wish, and that in court, the, quote, heaviest guards were put at pretty much every exit and entrance in the courtroom to ensure that they could handle Billy if he had any violent outbursts. They even removed all the water pitchers and glasses and anything else that Billy could throw and use to harm someone. And another reason for this, the sources told the papers, was because Billy kind of made it known that he was planning on disrupting the proceedings however he could. And so because of all this, apparently the judge decided to schedule a competency hearing for the next day, February 12th, which of course delayed the trial. So at this competency hearing, there was a psychologist who testified for the defense and one who testified for the state. Psychologist Dr. Irwin G. Weintraub testified for the defense. He was actually a consulting psychologist for the family court in Newcastle County, and he stated that he did believe Billy had a death wish. He was paranoid, believed that Governor DuPont was withholding evidence that would aid in his defense, that Judge Wright was out to hang him and not give him a fair trial, that the media was out to get him, and that he didn't trust his attorneys, he didn't trust the doctors, and he didn't trust anyone who was associated with the state of Delaware. Dr. Weintraub also testified that he did not think Billy could assist his attorneys in his defense. He also said that Billy's mental state had deteriorated in between the conversations he had had with him. He had had conversations with Billy between November and Monday night, February 11th. And in between that time, and in between those interviews, that, Billy's mental status has definitely deteriorated. Dr. Weintraub testified that he believed, personally, that Billy did not belong in prison, that he should be in a state mental hospital for the rest of his life. However, the psychiatrist, Dr. Robert W. Buckley, who testified for the state and was medical director at Delaware State Hospital, testified that he believed Billy had no mental illness, had no mental defect, and was completely and perfectly competent to stand trial. He called Billy's paranoia, quote, understandable responses by a person in his circumstances, already in prison for life and now facing a possible death sentence. Dr. Buckley said that he had tried to talk to Billy the day before this hearing, but he found Billy unresponsive. And after Dr. Buckley had testified to that, Billy kind of interrupted the proceedings and shouted, quote, I should have punched you in your mouth, from the defense table. Judge Wright, of course, rebuked Billy for this outburst, saying, quote, you have a perfect right to be here for your trial, but we will take you out into another room and conduct the trial without you if we have to. And of course, this just made Billy angrier, and he retorted to the judge, quote, that's what you want to do anyway. And Judge Wright, tried to deny this, saying, quote, that is not what I want to do. Sue Ann testified. She was definitely Billy's biggest supporter at this time. So she testified, and she stated that she saw Billy every week in jail and said, quote, "Billy tells me lots of things he doesn't tell other people. He knows where he's going and what he wants to do." She also testified that Billy had once told her, quote, "If he found out he did kill those people, he didn't think he had a right to live." And when she was asked whether she believed her foster brother had a mental illness or a mental defect, she confidently said, quote, "No, I do not." Okay. In the end, Judge Wright ordered for Billy's murder trial to continue. Another source said that jury selection began on February 12th, so I don't know if they had sat a jury on February 5th and just dismissed the jury and started it fresh, or if that jury selection had been delayed. Not quite sure. I couldn't find those details in the papers. Judge Wright also ordered for Mullen and Hillis to continue on as Billy's defense attorneys. And with that, Billy's murder trial finally began on February 13th, 1980. Deputy Attorney General James E. Liguori was the lead prosecutor. And he described the crime against the Lambertsons as, quote, "murder without rhyme or reason." He described the attack on the Lambertsons in great detail. And then first he described, the attack with the pistol, how Clara had been shot from behind. Quote, "But he was not happy with that. Not happy at all. Maybe that old Kent County farmer tried to protect himself and his wife by going for a shotgun that was kept in the house." And he described what Billy had done with the shotgun. And he made sure to emphasize that, using that 12-gauge single-barreled shotgun, that it had to be cracked and reloaded after every shot. So definitely, trying to really point out the premeditation here. Sue Ann testified recounting the events of that day. She said, her and Billy had been close and that he had spent the week prior to the murders at her house with her and her husband. She also testified that they did have to persuade him to go back to Plummer House to check in the Sunday before the murders. And I wonder if she meant the week before the murders, because as we know, Billy was taken to Plummer House the Friday before the murders. She said Billy didn't appear drunk at her house, but he did take a drink of something when he was there. I don't know if this was in reference to the day of the murders. And when Liguori showed the bottle, it was the pint of vodka to the jury, to introduce it as evidence, I guess Billy asked, quote, "Mind if I have a drink?" Reba from the liquor store testified, as did Charles and Corporal Robbins. Mary testified. I think they meant Mary Ann. And Ernest from the ammunition shop also testified. And Magistrate Stump also testified to everything that we had gone over. It is said as his trial was going on and testimony was, being spoken and stuff, Billy just kind of sat quiet in between his attorneys. Sometimes he'd have his head back and his eyes closed. And sometimes he even smiled. I guess when Liguori tripped on the way to the podium at one point, Billy openly laughed. And he said, quote, "He's anxious to get me." Dr. Judith G. Tobin was the assistant state medical examiner, and she had actually performed the autopsies on the Lambertsons. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail about that. She testified to Gilbert's injuries, saying that he had 2 gunshots to his right hand, his chest, and to his face. And that the shotgun blast actually to his face had actually fractured his skull and disrupted his brain. She said numerous pellets and the plastic that they were packed inside were found in Gilbert's head. And she also stated that any one of these 3 shots were fatal. So I don't know if she was including the hand shots as well. But yeah, pretty much most of the shots were fatal. She said Gilbert was shot at a distance of closer than 10 feet, and this was due to the lack of satellite wounds by the pellets. She testified that either one of the shotgun shots that Clara had received would have been fatal. And, like with Gilbert, she found the pellets and the plastic that they were packed inside in Clara's body. Although she stated that Clara was more than likely shot at a greater distance because she did have the satellite wounds. But she did say that more than likely the fatal shots killed the Lambertsons instantly. So at least they didn't suffer, I guess. I guess that's the only silver lining you can say to that, right? FBI experts also testified, and they said that some of the shells and cartridges and casings they found at the crime scene did come from the 2 murder weapons, and that a bloody footprint probably came from Billy. FBI agent John W. Kilty also testified that scrapings from Billy's left hand did show gunshot residue. Now, when it was the defense's turn to present their case. Hillis said that the Lambertsons' deaths were, quote, not murder, but unfortunate deaths precipitated by a sick, lonely, and isolated person. He asked the jury not to exonerate his client, but to consider what had happened as part of a, quote, lifetime of misery. And he started with kind of Billy's life story, right? Starting with his upbringing, his parents, how he bounced from one foster home and one reform school to another, how he was made to feel unloved and unwanted, and finally, right, deprived of his freedom, his family, and his child. He described Billy as much of a victim of the murders as the Lambertsons. I don't know if that's a good thing to say to the jury. He said Billy, quote, is not a white knight in shining armor, but a human being under intense pressure, an emotional and disturbed person. Sue Ann testified for the defense, of course, right? Because, she was called as a state's witness, of course. But she also, right, testified for the defense. Like I said, she was Billy's biggest defender. She talked about Billy's past, the accident with Christine, and how that had actually started Billy's drinking. But, in actuality, it didn't really start his drinking. It might have sent it over the edge, but as we know, Billy had a drinking problem since he was 10 years old. She said the year Susan left him that Billy had told her he was taking medication, and it was for epilepsy because of, quote, shotgun pellets in his brain. She said him not being able to see his daughter really upset him, and he was also really upset at being back in jail because, quote, he knew the state was trying to sentence him to jail for life under the Habitual Criminal Act, and he couldn't understand why. Couldn't understand why. On Thursday, February 21st, Dr. Weintraub, again, testified for the defense, and he reiterated that Billy was, quote, violent, explosive, antisocial, and out of control when he committed the murders. He wasn't in his right mind. He said Billy was, quote, once he lost his composure, he lost his judgment. He was incapable of exercising self-control. He also said, to his understanding, and after his interviews with Billy, that Billy had no recollection of the events, of the murders, and that he had acted in a, quote, explosive and uncontrollable manner when he killed the Lambertsons. But he could not say for sure whether Billy was aware that people could die when he pulled the trigger. However, he did state that Billy did know the difference between right and wrong. In his last interview with Billy, he stated that he had pathological paranoia, a suspicion of everyone, and that Billy felt that he was, quote, a sacrificial lamb to society. And he also believed that his trial was just a, quote, showcase. During his conversations with him, Dr. Weintraub said that Billy did have, moments of calm, of coherent conversation even, and he also had outbursts when he, quote, expressed his individuality. Dr. Buckley also testified, again, for the state, and he repeated, right, that he believed Billy was not mentally ill. He told the jury that extreme emotional distress did show up in the Delaware State Code. However, it had no psychiatric definition. Another doctor from the Delaware State Hospital, Dr. S.M. Iqbal, they also testified for the state, and they also testified to what Dr. Buckley said, that they believed Billy was not mentally ill. Specifically, that Billy was not mentally ill when he killed the Lambertsons. It is said when Dr. Buckley was testifying, Billy was pretty visibly agitated. He would look at the ceiling and he'd have a brief outburst of profanity. Other testimony that happened was from alcohol counselors, pretty much testifying to Billy's problem with alcohol, his depression, his family problems, and of course, right, his life in and out of jail. And after all of this, the defense then rested their case, of course, never calling Billy to the stand. That would have been a bad call. During their closing arguments, Mullen asked her client how he was doing, and Billy just responded, quote, how would you be doing? As far as I'm concerned, they can hang me before I get back to the prison. During the state's closing arguments, Liguori pointed out that Billy had obtained the weapons and the ammunition days before the murders. And he said this proved that Billy was not in a state of emotional distress. And specifically because he had, gotten all that days before the murders, he was not in emotional distress when he pulled the trigger on the Lambertsons. He also pointed out that Billy could have used one of those many weapons he had to commit suicide when he was at the Cokers rather than a steak knife. And when Liguori said this specific part, right, that he could have used the gun, I guess this caused Sue Ann to shout, this is sickening, and she, ran from the courtroom. Liguori asserted in his closing arguments that Billy could control his emotions if he wanted to. Quote, throughout this agonizing trial, he's been controlling his emotions, hasn't he? And Billy openly responded to that remark, saying, quote, The only reason I'm controlling them is so I won't punch you in the mouth. Judge Wright then sent the jury out of the courtroom, and he told Billy that he would order him to be held in an adjoining room unless he behaved himself. And he said that he was giving him, quote, one more chance in the courtroom if he tells me he will behave. But when the jury was let back into the courtroom, Billy was not there. And the case was then sent to them for deliberations. And what they had to decide was if Billy had been under extreme emotional distress when he pulled the trigger on the Lambertsons. That was like the key. That's why both the defense and the state were focusing on that. And the difference was a conviction of first-degree murder or manslaughter, death, or life in prison. And after only 2 hours and 25 minutes, the jury found Billy guilty on all the charges. And apparently he had been led into the courtroom when the jury had reconvened and had their sentence, and it said Billy was pretty unemotional when they read it. And as he was being led out of the courtroom by the guards, Sue Ann just shouted that she loved her brother more than anything. The sentencing hearing was then held on Monday, February 25th, and after just over 2.5 hours of deliberations, the jury came back with the death penalty. Billy would be the third person to sit on Delaware's death row. Although when the sentence was handed down, Billy was not in the courtroom. Judge Wright had evicted him after Billy told Ligori, quote, go on and get the thing over with. And Ligori afterwards said the state fought, quote, unequivocally and vigorously for the death penalty, and he cited 4 aggravating circumstances for why they believed the death penalty was the appropriate punishment. 1, the murders were committed by someone who had already escaped prison. 2, the killer was already on a run after committing robbery. 3, Billy had killed 2 or more persons. And lastly, the murders were, quote, outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible, or inhuman. And if you'll remember from past cases, right, even 1 aggravating circumstance qualified one for the death penalty, and Ligori cited 4. Ligori said that the jury shouldn't, quote, give a second thought to Billy Bailey because he did not give a second thought to Gilbert Lambertson when he put the gun to his head and fired, or to Clara Lambertson when he brutalized her. He deserves to own up and suffer for what he did. He deserves the death penalty. Mullen had instead, Wright, urged the jury to show compassion, pointing out that Billy had been deprived of a family practically his whole life, and, quote, rejected by society and as a product of institutions operated by this state. She said, quote, pity, not vengeance, and understanding, not retribution, is what he deserved, meaning life in prison. She said killing Billy would be a, quote, final act of barbarism by society against her client, and that nothing was going to bring the Lambertsons back. And it was during Ligori's rebuttal arguments that Billy had his outburst and was sent from the courtroom. And apparently, as he entered the adjoining room where Judge Wright had sent him, he evidently slammed the door into a police officer. It was a state police officer who was guarding him, because remember, he had like a whole horde of guards escorting him. And of course, when this happened, the whole platoon of guards piled on Billy to restrain him. Before reading the sentence, Wright asked Mullen if her client had anything that he wanted forwarded to the court. And she just responded, quote, no instructions that I wish to convey to the court. And after the sentencing was read, Judge Wright ordered for Billy to be hung on March 28th, although right, that would of course be delayed because there was going to be the automatic appeals process. Additionally, Wright also sentenced Billy to an additional 97 years in prison, and this was specifically for the robbery and weapons charges. When his attorneys informed Billy about his fate, Mullen told reporters, quote, I think he had prepared himself for it, saying that he was unemotional when they told him. Sue Ann had openly sobbed and wept when the sentence had been read, while the Lambertsons and their supporters were just kind of quiet and solemn on the other side of the courtroom. On Monday, March 10th, Mullen and Hillis filed a notice of appeal and a motion for a stay of execution, and this was with the clerk at Delaware Supreme Court. There was also an appeal for the life sentence that he had received for being a habitual offender. Although I'm unclear if Mullen and Hillis filed that as well, or if another defense attorney was handling that. On Friday, March 14th, Billy wrote the Delaware Supreme Court justices, was William T. Quillen and William Duffy. He wrote the 2 justices, and he wrote them a 2-page letter. And in this 2-page letter, he was asking for all of his appeals processes to be dropped, and he stated that he just wanted to be hanged already. Quote, it appears that justice isn't for me. There's just so much wrong with my trying to get people to realize I am a human being. It appears you people will continue on treating me like a dog, so drop my appeal as of today and hang me. And throughout his rant in his letter, he referred to himself in the third person, kept referring to himself as Bill Bailey, and he denied the, quote, alleged forgery charge at think that was probably the charge from Kent County. He accused Judge Wright, quote, maintained his not welcome attitude throughout his trial, quote, and forced the attorneys to remain on the case after they told Bailey he was receiving an unfair trial. He also said that one of the jury members was married to a corrections officer and maintained that, quote, most of the jury members know the victims and their families, and such other related and relevant complaints I feel help me to reach the decision of wanting to die, because it appears that justice isn't for me. The test at the state hospital proved, as I stated, I robbed the store, but while under the same drug, it was also said, as the lawyer taped it, I did not kill those people. Yeah, what do you do, with that kind of, ranting and raving? Of course, Billy's letter did nothing to stop the appeals process. By state law, all death sentences, right, were automatically appealed. It didn't matter. They were specifically appealed all the way to the state Supreme Court. So it doesn't matter what the person receiving the death penalty wanted. It seems that it was just kind of like an automatic process. Mullen and Hillis were unaware of Billy's letter, but they were also not really surprised by it. Mullen said, quote, he had indicated he did not want to proceed with an appeal. And in June of that year, the Lambertsons' 4 adult children actually brought an unprecedented lawsuit against the state of Delaware. They specifically brought it against Delaware Superior Court, asserting that the state should be held responsible when innocent citizens were killed by inmates. They were being represented by Wilmington attorney Clifford B. Hearn Jr., and the suit claimed that their parents wouldn't have been killed if the state had taken better care of their prison system and, if they had just, not allowed Billy on work release, which, as we already went through, was a whole series of errors that even led to that. The suit stated that the state of Delaware was negligent on 2 counts. First, it failed to consider all of Billy's records when he was released. And 2, the state allowed Billy to escape once authorities realized that he shouldn't have been on work release. Now, though I guess this lawsuit was unprecedented because though the state can't really be sued, Hearn said that this case was unique. And that was because Billy was clearly the wrong type of inmate, the wrong type of person to be out on this work release furlough program. And he said the state had a, quote, an absolute obligation to keep Billy locked up, and that the state did decide to allow Billy to escape from Plummer House. Thus, right, the lawsuit, thus the state was negligent. And that will do it for part 1 of the Billy Bailey case. And like I said in the beginning, this is one of those cases where the actual crime, right, was solved and court process was kind of, gone through. He was found guilty. But there's just so much more to get into. This case would not end up being concluded until 1996, guys. Yeah, long time. And, what do you guys think of Billy so far? I definitely agree with the defense. I think Billy, specifically Dr. Weintraub, I definitely think that Billy should have been in a mentally ill hospital. I think there should be homes for people like Billy who are maybe mentally disabled, maybe just don't really have the skills to live on their own independently, but right, of course, treated humanely and shit. It's so annoying that I have to preface that. But yeah, it's just, he was kind of set up to fail, right? And I'm wondering if just the Seaman's intervention was just kind of too little too late by that point, Yeah, and I feel so sorry for the Lambertsons. That's horrible, dude. To live your whole life, raise your family, doing your thing, enjoying retirement, and then that happens. Oh my God. Yeah, a stranger coming into your home and just, that's awful. Yeah, so this is definitely a case that is not over yet. We will be back in 2 weeks for our last crime dive before I go and have my baby. Cross your fingers for me. Let me know your thoughts down below. Do you feel sorry for Billy? Do you think he kind of got what he deserved? I'm super curious to know what you guys think, especially about cases like this, when it's definitely not really black and white. And once again, thank you for all your comments. I think I'm caught up on them. I'm trying really hard. As I said in the beginning, Jeff has been helping me. He just kind of goes through and likes the ones that, are sweet and stuff, and then he tells me which ones I should respond to. It's usually the case suggestion ones. But, yeah. And speaking of case suggestions, thank you again to Tyler Manter for suggesting this case. Every time it's a Delaware case, man. All right, well, it is super hot. Again, I hope my fan did not create too much, like, ambient noise, but, like, dudes, no, like, I was gonna pass out. Like, I was like sweating so bad that I couldn't even put makeup on. So thank you for putting up with that. Also, again, rest in peace, Papa. It was really, really sad. I'm really glad I got to see him one last time when he was happy and healthy. And I guess I'll sign off with that. Take care of yourself out there. Remember, I will be back next Wednesday for the final Crime Dip episode, and then I'll be back in 2 weeks to conclude this case with y'all. And I don't know how long I'll be gone, but I will definitely be working on cases, and I'll try to be back as soon as possible. So yeah, until we meet again, whether it's Wednesday or Tuesday, I hope you take care of yourself out there. Look out for yourself. Remember, don't be a dick unjustifiably, and leave a little sparkle wherever you go. Alrighty, y'all. I will see you either next week or in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.